Our next panel is from Selma to Ferguson, Grassroots Activism from the Meredith March to Black Lives Matter. And I'll give the introduction for the three speakers and then let them go in order. I guess we'll, Stefan Bradley, and then Salamishah, and Yohuru Williams. Or we're going to do it Yohuru Williams, Salamishah, and Stefan Bradley. That's how we're doing it.
We'll figure it out.
We'll figure it out.
Okay. All right, so let me introduce our speakers. So our first speaker, Yohuru Williams, is also going to be our keynote tomorrow. He's a professor of history and dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at Fairfield University. He's the author of Black Politics, White Power, Civil Rights, Black Power, and the Black Panthers in New Haven, teaching U.S. history beyond the textbook and rethinking the Black freedom movement. He is the editor of A Constant Struggle, African American History from 1865 to the Present, and the co-editor of In Search of the Black Panther Party, New Perspectives on a Revolutionary Movement, and Liberated Territory toward a Local History of the Black Panther Party. Then we're going to have Salamishah Tillet. She's an associate professor of English and Africana Studies and a faculty member of the Alice Paul Center for Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. She received her PhD in the History of American Civilization and AM in English from Harvard University and her MAT from Brown University. She graduated Phi Beta Kappa from the University of Pennsylvania, where she received her BA in English and Afro-American Studies. And all these folks are well-known public intellectuals, I should add as well. And then finally, we have Stefan Bradley, who is currently director of the African American Studies program and associate professor in the Department of History at St. Louis University. He received his PhD from the University of Missouri-Columbia and MA from Washington State University. He's written a number of books, including a terrific book on Columbia University and Black studies there. And his latest book project is Black Ivy, Civil Rights, Black Power in the Ivy League in Post-War America. And they're going to be talking about really what we've all been, I think, talking about over the last roughly 24 months. Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson in the summer of 2014, and the no indictment grand jury came shortly before Thanksgiving, and 9 days later, Eric Garner in Staten Island, and there was no indictment there too. So what you saw was really the start of a real movements for social justice that were really building and amplifying on the civil rights movement's heroic period, the Black Power period, the period of radical feminist activism, Latino activism in terms of the Chicano movement. All these different movements sparked up again. So we're going to talk about that. So let's start.
Thanks, Peniel. How's everybody doing today?
All right, how are you?
That's good. I don't have a lot of time with you, but I can promise you that my colleagues and I have some, I think, synchronicity in our presentations. I'm going to give you the broad historical overview, and then Stefan is actually going to talk about the contemporary moment, and Salamishah, quite frankly, got us all excited during the break, so I know you're in for a treat when she takes the podium to do cleanup, but it won't be cleanup at all. From Selma to Ferguson is an interesting title because in a lot of ways we find ourselves in a moment where history speaks to us probably in ways that were unimaginable when Barack Obama was elected president in 2008. We had all that conversation about a post-racial America, and interestingly, in that moment, when we thought about Selma, this cartoon in a lot of ways came to mind. This notion that somehow we had this second bridge to freedom, that this was the culmination of the American Revolution, of our core democratic values, all the things that we hold dear. And yet, at the same time, what the contemporary moment has been an indictment on our failure for the progressive legislation that we pushed through during the civil rights era to address the deeply entrenched segregation, racism, inequality that exists in our society, particularly in the area of criminal justice. I say that because when we look at Barack Obama's second inaugural, one of the things that the president said in that inaugural address, in kind of laying together and lacing together the history, was to focus specifically on three places. Stonewall, which was historic, first time that anyone had talked about gay rights in a presidential address in that manner. Seneca Falls, which of course connected him to the women's movement, but Selma, Why not Montgomery? Why not Birmingham? Why not Chicago? But it was Selma. What was so special about Selma? And it was particularly powerful for me because part of what Obama did is say it was our generation's task to carry on what those pioneers began. He continued, our journey is not complete until our wives, our mothers, our daughters can earn a living. It's not complete until our gay brothers and sisters are treated like anyone else. It's not complete until immigration. But what he didn't talk about is it not being complete until we didn't have dead teenagers populating the streets of American cities from Ferguson to Baltimore to Staten Island to Sandra Bland in Texas, Raynette Turner, so insert Tamir Rice, insert name here. It was powerful because in a lot of ways, when we think back to the Selma moment, as Charlene talked about, it began with grassroots activism. But what really coalesced that Selma moment was an act of violence. James Orange had been arrested. In fact, I want to talk about this in this context, and again, I don't have a lot of time with you, but I don't want to talk about the Black Lives Matter movement. I want to talk about Black Lives Matter moments. Because Selma, in a lot of ways, the murder of Jimmy Lee Jackson was a Black Lives Matter moment. This cartoon by Herblock in 1965, March of 65, expertly captures the brutality that protesters faced. And as an Alabama state trooper, I got one of them just almost as she made it back to the church. And he could have been talking about the mother of Jimmy Lee Jackson. The power of that is that we know that the officer that killed Jimmy Lee Jackson was only recently convicted of the crime, Bernard Fowler. And it's ironic in some sense because we focus on the importance of the symbolism of Barack Obama in this moment, and yet at the point at which we get an African-American president, we have the greatest retrenchment, the recognition that Jim Crow justice remains the most intractable of what I like to call the 6 degrees of segregation. Segregation in housing, segregation in places of public accommodation. If I had more time, I'd continue. But I think it's important for us to recognize that in that Selma moment, we see the reflection of the modern moment. And I don't like when people say that history repeats itself where it rhymes. I don't like to say that they're the same things. I don't want to make those kind of equivalencies, but I do think that in some sense we have to appreciate and understand that history if we can understand the contemporary. So when the contemporary and the historical meet, it gives us an opportunity to reflect on why history matters in the same way that Charlene talked about it. And I want to point this out because I love this. They're asking essentially the same question that Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman asked during Freedom Summer in 1964. And I want to say this to you, and be very clear, that was a Black Lives Matter moment. But not for the reason that most people would say. Before I get there, though, I want to talk about history as a window into the past because sometimes, as Charlene pointed out, our young people don't connect the dots because they're woefully unaware of that history. But often, old folks don't connect the dots because we find ourselves so inextricably caught in the moment, in our American progress narrative and how far we've come. Black Lives Matter moments are about the failure of American democracy. We can talk about the dire anti-lynching bill, the failure of the United States government to respond to lynching, of state governments to respond to lynching as a matter of Black Lives Matter. It gave birth to some activists that we're very familiar with, female activists like Ida B. Wells and Mary Church Terrell, whose names we've also forgotten, but who stand as giants and pioneers in trying to make America recognize that if you say in your founding documents, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by the Creator of certain inalienable rights, among these are life, and you deny people the access to life because they can be cut down by mobs and duly deputized authorities will do nothing to protect those lives, that's a Black Lives Matter moment. Most of what Ida B. Wells writes about is that Black Lives Matter, so why isn't anybody doing anything to prevent lynching in the South? I also want to say to you that the Reverend Dr. King, when we talk about hands up, don't shoot, actually commented on hands up, don't shoot. If you listen to King's eulogy of Jimmy Lee Jackson, it's powerful what he says, and if you close your eyes, it's almost as if he's talking about today. What King said is a state trooper pointed the gun, but he did not act alone. He was murdered, Jimmy Lee Jackson, by the brutality of every sheriff who practices lawlessness in the name of law. Ha ha. He was murdered by the irresponsibility of every politician from governors on down who has fed his constituents the stale bread of hatred and the spoiled meat of racism. He was murdered by the timidity of a federal government that can spend millions of dollars a day to keep troops in South Vietnam and cannot protect the rights of its own citizens. seeking the right to vote. He was murdered by the indifference of every white minister of the gospel who has remained silent behind the safe security of his stained glass windows. And he was murdered by the cowardice of every Negro who passively accepts the evils of segregation and stands on the sidelines in this struggle for justice. Because it was a Black Lives Matter moment. I say that to you because when we talk about Say Her Name and we look at how we have dealt with the issue of women in this context, it's important for us to understand that historically there have been many women because, as Charles Payne argued, men lead and women organize, that if we're going to study the civil rights movement and look at the impact of the civil rights movement, then we should certainly understand that the women who spoke about Black Lives Matter, people like Susie King Taylor, people like Mary Church Terrell, were doing so in a context where they were saying, we recognize that this is a danger not only to Black and brown bodies, it's a danger to democracy. Because if one can't live and work in an environment where they are free from violence, from intimidation, then you don't have a democracy. It was powerful for me in the aftermath of the killing of Sandra Bland that you got that infamous tweet. Dear uppity, mouthy, criminal Chicago travelers in Texas, if you get snotty with our Texas DPS, we will pull you the F out of your car and place you under arrest. That's exactly what we pay them for. And if I see that go down, I will back the officer up every time. Do what you're told and shut STFU. You're incredibly lucky you didn't get tased or your head blown off. Just because you decided to kill yourself later does not make anything other than a menace to society, as so clearly illustrated by the dash cam video. Police lives matter. You missed the point. Brother Bradley is going to talk about, Stefan is going to talk about how youth have reacted to this. Salamishah is going to show you how our culture and the power of Nina Simone responded to this. But I need you to understand, this is not a new phenomenon. I need you to understand that in this context because we talk about Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman, but it's what Rita Schwerner says to President Johnson, to who his credit, was an ally in a lot of ways. But when those 3 civil rights workers go missing and their bodies are discovered in an earthen dam in Philadelphia, Mississippi, and the President of the United States sends flowers to the 2 dead white civil rights workers and not to James Chaney's family, Rita Schwerner took the opportunity to say, Mr. President, Black Lives Matter. Mr. President, listen, Mr. President. My husband and Michael did not die in vain. If he and Andrew Goodman had been Negroes, the world would have taken little notice of their deaths. Rita Schwerner was saying, in 1964, Black lives matter. So if we go from Jimmy Lee Jackson to Eric Garner, and we understand the problem of memory, the danger that we find ourselves in now is that all these names, because remember a couple of years ago, Trayvon Martin dripped from our tongues with such facility. And there are people now who go, Trayvon who? We have to understand that if we are not lazy in the way that we try to make the connection between the past and the present, this isn't Ku Klux Klan violence. This isn't injustice perpetrated by people who come in the cover of the night. This is official lawlessness. And the danger is that it puts in jeopardy the very nature of our American democracy. It forces us to recognize that whether the injustice comes at the end of a noose or whether it comes at the end of a criminal justice system that fails to respond to the needs of a populace, that the injustice is the same. And at the end of the day, it forces us to recognize that if in 2015, we're still talking about not the superficial Emmett Till is like Trayvon Martin, but the real jury of your peers remains a problem when you're looking at juries that remain all or mostly white, then our democracy is broken. Fundamentally compromised. It forces us to recognize and appreciate the fact that J.W. Milam and Roy Bryant got off because the jury recognized more with their narrative about protecting what was theirs than recognizing that the life of a 13-year-old boy had been lost in Mississippi and nobody cared that his life mattered. We respond to those moments in different ways. We ask ourselves, in some sense, whether at the core our democracy can respond to those traumas that led people to organize in the 1950s and the 1960s around things like the right to sit in a restaurant, the right to be able to go to school, so on and so forth. But I want to quote Kathy Caruth, who says, we also have to be careful that wounds produce narratives, that it is the train of injustices and abuses sometimes that create the stories that we tell ourselves. And that this generation, if we're not careful, will tell us when it looks back that we had an opportunity, not through a Ferguson Commission report, but through a hashtag on Twitter, to recognize that it didn't take a dummy to realize that Black lives are under assault. And if we truly value life, then we as a society have a responsibility to respond before it's too late. Thank you.
Maybe it was a tactical error letting Yohuru go before me. I'll get you next time, brother. I greet you from a place where in August 2014 we shouted, "Hands up, don't shoot." I greet you from a place where in October 2014 we said, "If we don't get it, shut it down." I greet you from a place where they hollered, "The whole damn system is guilty as hell." I greet you from a place where young people have taken protest to policy and will bring it to progress. I greet you from St. Louis, from Ferguson, and the metropolitan area. I'd like to do some thank yous if I could. My wife told me to act like I've been here before because I just like to say I'm a bit of a country bumpkin. You all have the good Harvard people here and the people coming from Penn and everywhere else, and these are rock stars. I'm a bit of a bumpkin. You read the bio. I come from Yakima, Washington. So for me, I can't act like I've been here before. I have to tell you, thank you for the people that set up the microphones, who made the sandwiches. Thank you to the people at the hotel. Thank you for that. And thank you all for your hospitality. But most of all, thank you to the Lyndon Baines Johnson School and to Professor Pennell Joseph, who you all see as a director of the new center. But for some of us, we see him as a role model. We see him as a trailblazer. And so I'm thankful to you, brother. I'm thankful. And thank you for letting me be here. I won't take a whole bunch of time, unlike Sister Hunter Galt, and I'm so pleased to be able to touch the microphone that she breathed on. I told you, I don't have much class. Unlike her, she was reared in the AME tradition. I was reared in the Baptist tradition. So somebody please keep track of the time. Now do you understand what we felt? Asked a participant in the now famous 1968 rebellion at Columbia University in the city of New York on the night that St. Louis County Prosecuting Attorney Robert McCullough announced that he would not be indicting Officer Darren Wilson for the shooting death of Ferguson teenager Michael Brown Jr. After short-stopping an interview with MSNBC's Chris Hayes and crawling under the fence of a locked-down compound to race to my car that was 20 feet from the public storage building that had gone up in flames, to pulling on the hot handles of the car and entering the smoke-filled vehicle, to driving through the red light, to driving on the wrong side of the road to avoid the burning garbage cans on the right side of the road, to seeing police and National Guardsmen everywhere, to hearing the moans, and I hope you understand me, to hearing the moans of mothers and the threats of young, hopeless people. I had finally felt what I had written about for so many years. Before I ended the interview with Chris Hayes, I explained that more than angry or shocked, I was saddened because the narrative of that night would be that the lawless, ungrateful black youth delighted in destroying other people's property. The narrative that I understood from my interactions with the people on the ground was that of hopelessness because of the poverty-stricken circumstances in which they lived and powerlessness in the relationship with justice and political systems. I once asserted, this is back near the time of the uprisings, that America should send young black citizens a thank you note for rescuing democracy. As I watched young people in Hong Kong, you may not remember this, fight for their version of democracy, I knew, and this is after the uprising, just after, I knew that for as long as there are black youth in this country, democracy will live. When Michael Brown Jr. died at the hands of Ferguson officer Darren Wilson, many were aghast at yet another police killing of an unarmed black male. The ensuing demonstrations and law enforcement reaction to the protesters had given me cause to question the security of democracy in America. Scholars in the future will focus on two issues: the value of black life in this nation and who gets to be an American citizen. In these periodicals that people were writing in, others have discussed the suspension of certain rights for mostly black people as they peacefully express their anger and determination to find justice for the killer of Mike Brown. In the process, people all over the world have observed just how fragile our version of democracy can be. Historians writing about the Ferguson crisis will have to mention two events that brought the Black Freedom Campaign to light. The first is the use of technology. The Sister Hunter Galt was right. The Twitters and the Instagram and the Snapchats were important because they allowed these young people to get beyond the images that the conventional media portrayed. There was no filter. The second thing that historians will focus on is the arrests of two journalists, one from the Washington Post, the other from the Huffington Post. The images of black people being violated shocked the world, true indeed. But what rattled this nation was the idea that even professional journalists could be affected by the overzealous policing that was prevalent during the early days of the demonstration. And speaking about the early days of the demonstrations, on Saturday, August 9th, I got a text from a former student telling me that a young black man in the Canfield Green Apartments in Ferguson had been shot, and people were starting to get rowdy. I hoped it wouldn't get out of hand, but it seemed like the boy's body lay in the street for an eternity. Now, to understand the tragedy in this, one must spend some time in St. Louis during the month of August. And if you do, you will feel the combination of heat and humidity that leads some residents to refer to their home city and state as St. Louis misery. It just so happened that my father, Command Sergeant Major retired Alfonso Bradley, had come to visit, and so I had gathered him from the airport, which is quite near Ferguson. The next day, I was supposed to deliver a lecture at Washington Tabernacle Baptist Church, which is a church that hosted both Martin Luther King Jr. and Angela Davis at one point. I began my lecture by wishing my father a happy birthday, but by also asking for a moment of silence for Michael Brown, yet another black man who had been shot dead. That Sunday night, my phone went abuzz as a current student of mine notified me that the Quick Trip was burning. I knew people had to be out of their rational minds because it seemed no one thought through setting a gas station afire. I received a phone call from the same student just after midnight. He said he was afraid for another one of my students who had been in a confrontation with a police officer near West Florissant Avenue. The police had pepper sprayed, tear gassed, and shot my student with rubber pellets. All I heard was shots, so I started getting dressed and reached for my knife. This also didn't make sense. The student who called said that his friend, my student, had just made it to another mentor's home where he was trying to wash the pepper spray off his skin and out of his eyes. I heard from my students later that Monday morning that they had prayerfully lived through it all. They said they were headed back out that evening. I told them not to, and I told them I didn't need any martyrs to know that they cared about justice. They were, however, and you have to be younger to understand this, turned up. And they weren't listening to my dissuasion. Even though I had personally, listen to me, I had personally taught them about the Black Freedom Movement, my students had seen something that changed them forever. Inasmuch they were resolute about hitting the streets again. And I knew that if I couldn't stop them, then I'd have to join them. Now, I've written about black revolutionaries like H. Rap Brown and Stokely Carmichael, and you should buy 100 copies of Pennell Joseph's biography of Stokely Carmichael. Buy it for Valentine's Day, it's coming up. But I don't know anybody who would accuse me of being a revolutionary. Listen to me, I vote and I wear ties to go to work at my predominantly white institution. I'm not easily given to marching in the streets or fist pumping. There was, however, the issue of my students. So I knew I had to be where they were. And with that in mind, I parked my car at the O'Reilly's on West Florissant, and I called my wife to let her know where it was, in case I got arrested or worse. And I walked up on the burnt-out Quick Trip, and I saw two young black women writing on the asphalt with chalk. When I approached them, I read three of the most profound and unforgettable words ever. They wrote, "Black men matter." Now, this is before the phrase Black Lives Matter started getting hot and that sort of thing. They wrote, "Black men matter." It was so simple, but so crucial for the moment. As I took that statement to heart, I met up with my students. Then the representatives of MSNBC's Chris Hayes show called to interview me, and I told them I'd be glad to do the interview as long as my students could be there too. I stood on this position because the portrayal of young black people in the national media to that point was of the young black thug who was not following instructions and making life hard on the police by refusing to be quiet when their friend was shot dead and laid out in the street. The news was not showing young black men who did not have tattoos or who were in college or who could coherently communicate their rage to an audience that stopped listening to black men when they saw dreadlocks. Now, follow me on this. I did not believe that college students were any better or more respectable than other youth, but I brought my students, one of whom happened to live in Ferguson, to provide some diversity to the portrayals of black youth. We told our stories of why something was waiting to happen. The black people had been mistreated in North County since they started moving out there 40 years ago. I listened, and this is the one time I'm not going to use a name, I listened to a Missouri state senator try to explain that race had nothing to do with this crisis. I stood next to this senator, but not with this senator. I disagreed, knowing that decades ago, black people who could afford it moved out to the county. Then, now we're talking about public affairs, then when the public housing that the city planners and architects in the post-war era thought would save the city closed, a large portion of those residents, and when I'm saying city housing, you understand that to mean projects, don't you? When they closed, many of those residents moved out to places like Ferguson and the Campfield Green projects, or complex, let me stop. Black people in St. Louis metropolitan area, they implicitly know that it's risky to drive a car in the county because the police loom waiting to write tickets that will provide money to these municipalities. And for anyone who has ever, and when you get a ticket, you gotta go to court. And anybody who's ever been in these courts, you'll realize race does too matter. Because if you're wondering where all the black people are, you'll find them in the courts. So as people took to the streets, they were exercising maybe the last piece of power that they had. their constitutional rights. It was an electric feeling to be among the people because the people believed they were right. I saw old people carrying signs and young people squaring off against the police because they believed righteousness would protect them. While out one night, I encountered a friend I hadn't seen in maybe 12 years, and we stopped to catch up and talk about what we were witnessing. At that moment, an officer with a rifle approached us and said that we had to keep moving, that we could not stand still in one spot for more than 5 seconds. In America, there was, of course, no law against talking on a public sidewalk when not obstructing anyone, and I challenge anyone to show me in the Constitution where it reads that we did not have the right to be. In spite of my clear knowledge of this, the officer's rifle was persuasive. I chuckled because, again, I hardly fathomed myself a threat in my spectacles and tie. Maybe I would read him to death. Later that night, my students and I tried to outrun the armored personnel vehicles and the tear gas canisters that belched from them, and the police clad in their riot gear. After eating my share of tear gas that night, I made it home safely to find my father still awake. He asked, "How did that CN gas taste?" He told stories about how during training, he used to train young soldiers. He would have a good laugh at the soldiers who were exposed to the tear gas. I didn't find the story funny that night. The previous day, we had driven through Ferguson, and when he heard the thumping of the helicopters and saw the heavy police presence, this combat veteran, my father, of the Korean and Vietnam conflicts, said, "This place is occupied." He told me to be careful and that he was proud that I was taking a stand. How much? Okay, I'm not going to ask. I watched the news to see the police were deeply concerned that some of the protesting people had firearms. I thought this was silly because, of course, some people, of course, had firearms. Missouri is proudly a concealed carry state, and guns are everywhere. There's even a constitutional right to bear arms for citizens. It's in that one piece of paper. And the Tea Party's been known to, anyhow. The threat of members of the mostly black protesting crowd having firearms, however, must have been quite frightening to the police and the rest of the nation. Part of this has to do with how some people envision citizenship. Rather than looking to the 14th Amendment of that piece of paper to which I referred to before, and I'm sure the Sister Leah, the attorney, will hop to it. I realize it's hard for some people to believe, but even loud, tattooed thugs with no shirts on and their unmentionables showing. I said that because I'm down in Texas. I know you all are polite. Even those people are citizens. And U.S. citizens deserve freedom rights. I made the comment once that if U.S. citizens were abroad and treated the way that some of the citizens of Ferguson had been treated those nights, the United States would have sent drones to ensure their freedom. Things during those days and nights moved quickly. A group of young black professionals and progressive individuals who had resources and young people and access to young people met to discuss strategy. And so I met with people like DeRay. I met from people that were executives of Teach for America and city treasurers and state representatives and college presidents, young college presidents, and this sort of thing. We met with faith leaders. We met with the governor, Jay Nixon. Some of us met several times with Claire McCaskill. Others spoke with the U.S. Attorney General and the senior advisor to the president on the telephone. We organized events for youth to share their experiences. We met constantly, but all the while, Our nights were spent in the streets, and we'd stop by the Ferguson Burger Bar to eat. We provided commentary to nearly every major international and national news network, demanding that the mayor of Ferguson step down, that the chief of police step down, that community policing be implemented, and that there be residency requirements for police officers, that a civilian review board with subpoena powers be instituted. We spoke with representatives from the Department of Justice and the U.S. Civil Rights Commission, and we met with the U.S. Secretary of Education. DeRay was there with us then. Members of this group went to the United Nations to explain what was happening in Ferguson. One of the young people, Brittany Pagnett, went on to work on the White House Task Force on policing. And we spent those sleepless nights. And at the funeral for Mike Brown that was held at a local church, I sat behind his friend Dorian Johnson, who shed tears but remained strong. And he sat next to the first black mayor of St. Louis, who was acting as his attorney. It's a bit of a sad blur, but I also remember 3 rows in front of me sat leaders like Jesse Jackson and T.D. Jakes and other figures. There was a bit of a controversy over who got to sit where. In testifying to the U.S. Civil Rights Commission, I spoke of the lingering effects of the war on drugs and the war on terrorism. I'm closing now. I told you I come from the Baptist tradition, so I get 3 closings. This is it. I was proud to be with the people during those early days and now, because they were smart enough to holler like hell when their freedom rights were violated. In my mind, that makes those people, even the ones with their unmentionables showing, even the ones with the tattoos showing on their neck, that makes them patriots. I argue that they saved American democracy in the same way that the Freedom Riders saved American democracy, in the same way that soldiers did. They made America realize just how far they had let the police state and authorities go without being checked. They made us remember that it is civilians who are supposed to control the military and the police force. They made America and the world notice that the militarized police force was almost as dangerous as policemen and women who shoot first and wait for the union to tell them what to do next. I charge that the whole world is watching. That used to be a phrase that some of you used to say back in the day. I charge that the whole world is watching. And how will we respond? In Ferguson, the city clerk, the city manager, and the city police chief stepped down. That happened because of the work of these young people. There is a consent decree that has been issued by the Department of Justice. This didn't happen on its own. It happened because these young people pushed the issue. That's good for America. That's good for America. This change doesn't happen without these young people caring enough to move things along. So I'd like to thank you for listening. Thank you.
So this is a prop. Okay. Good afternoon. I would like to thank our host, Professor Joseph, Peniel Joseph, for inviting all of us to share this space to meditate and deliberate on both the idea of progress and stasis when we think about where we are and where we've gone since the mid-'60s. And also thank the staff of the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy, my fellow panelists, and you, the audience, for sharing this space with me today. So I want to take us back, before the days when that Texas Bama, Queen or King Bay, the self-proclaimed mix of Negro with Creole, depending on your mood or medium, slayed the Super Bowl, slayed social media, slayed pop music with a strange mix of commerce, philanthropy, and protest with formation. And I found that Beyonce stops time, so if you begin a talk with her, you have the audience right away. I even want to take us a little further back before Meredith, that march against fear, that call, that original call to black men that went, as it usually did, awry due to white supremacist shotguns before it became a point of coalescence, another tipping and transition point in the long freedom struggle of Black America. I want to take us back to that bloody morning of September 15th, 1963, in order to offer up a new history and gesture towards a new genealogy of a prophetic Black feminist tradition that starts with the death of 4 little girls and comes to head in our current moment of Black Lives Matter and the movement within a movement of Say Her Name. And if you bear with me, I'd like to do this with a song. The only thing you got is music. Nina Simone rushed to make a gun. After learning that a bomb inside a Birmingham church killed 4 little Black girls, none of them older than 14, during Sunday school, she left her private den above her garage. She was sequestered there while preparing for an upcoming tour when the radio broadcasted news of the bombing. Later that day, she reached a breaking point. She rummaged through her storage downstairs, carrying back up various metal tools to improvise a pistol. Nina, you don't know anything about killing, interrupted Andy Stroud, her husband and former police officer. The only thing you got is music, he challenged. Simone, fueled by a mix of determination, fury, and hatred, ran back to her piano. That she never shot anyone that night, that would come many decades later, mattered little. When she failed, she wrote Mississippi Goddamn instead. Simone was rehearsing 1,000 miles north of the 16th Street Baptist Church on September 5th, 1963, when the news of the blast reached her and struck her dumb like St. Paul on this road to Damascus, she says. She had been radicalized earlier that summer by the assassination of Medgar Evers, but she had written Mississippi Goddamn within an hour of hearing this news, but waited 6 months before performing the song at Carnegie Hall in late March of 1964. Surprising her audience with a cheeky, cautionary preamble, this is a show tune, but the show hasn't been written for it yet. Simone took the biggest gamble of her career. The audience, mostly white, wealthy, and northern, nervously laughed as Simone began her performance. Well, you hear this part. The name of this tune is Mississippi Goddamn, and I mean every word of it. For those who had previously seen her at Carnegie Hall a mere year before, on April 12, 1963, during her first solo appearance there at the music's most prestigious venue, Carnegie Hall, Mississippi Goddamn must have sounded strange. A year before, Simone, decked in a bedazzled white dress and her brown mink stole, epitomized a stately elegance. The set list veered towards the classical and was decidedly uncommitted to civil rights. Songs from the opera Black Swan and Marlon Brando's wartime flick Sayonara earned her rave reviews from the New York Times music critic John Wilson, who wrote of that night, "She is a performer who's blessed with both talent and a strong sense of showmanship, so that even when her ideas do not gel, and some of them do not, it is interesting to follow the dauntless path of her imagination." Elated, Simone ran to her Mount Vernon home to call her friend Lorraine Hansberry and the author of the award-winning play A Raisin in the Sun. But on that Good Friday, Hansberry was in no mood. "What are you doing for the movement leaders?" she asked Simone as Martin Luther King sat.
Do you have a mic?
Yeah.
Can we put her mic up?
Okay, I'll just speak louder. She asked Simone as Martin Luther King sat writing his most famous letter from a Birmingham jail. That was before the bomb. Dear God, why? King had quietly pleaded after the 1963 bombing, just weeks after he ascended the steps of the Lincoln Memorial to share and improvise his dream for America at the close of the March on Washington. Now voicing his anger to President Kennedy, his telegram said that unless immediate federal steps are taken in Alabama, our country would witness the worst racial holocaust this nation has ever seen. 3 days later, while giving the eulogy for Addie Mae Collins, Carol Denise McNair, and Cynthia Diane Wellesley, 3 of the 4 girls killed in the bombing, King turned his existential cry into a call for empathy. And so I stand here to say this afternoon to all assembled here that in the spirit of the darkness of this hour, we must not despair, he implored. We must not become better. We must not harbor the desire to retaliate with violence. No, we must not lose faith in our white brothers. Recently, comedian Dick Gregory insisted, if you look at all the suffering that black folks went through, not one black man would dare say, Mississippi, goddamn. He went on, and then to have someone with her stature talking about your problems, you know how happy they had to be? Unlike King's faith, through Mississippi Goddamn, Simone contained and maintained the more controversial emotions, disbelief, fury, and most of all, rage that surfaced in the immediate hours after the bombing. In order to come to terms with this racial terror, many leaders publicly redirected those emotions, asking African Americans to push them down in order to forward a civil rights message of mutually linked interracial destiny. Simone's sharp Spitfire delivery, however, raised that which was still simmering just below the surface to the fore, becoming both a salve for a people teetering on the edge of explosion and a dire warning to America to either reckon with its racial past and present or remain in a perpetual state of sadism and division. So while We Shall Overcome may be the most accessible protest song of the 20th century, sparking sing-alongs and grassroots covers, its virtuoso mix of genres and its explicit condemnation of segregation and its critique of racial gradualism made Mississippi Goddamn, what I argue, the real anthem of the civil rights movement. On one hand, the song captured the ideological battles among young activists, white moderates, and Southern segregationists. Immediately after the song's official release, white record buyers from Arkansas and Mississippi returned the album, smashed in half, to her label, which in turn prompted white television executives in the North to simply rescind their offers for Simone to appear on their shows because of its content. At the same time, young activists from SNCC claimed Mississippi as their anthem for Freedom Summer, that bloody 1964 campaign to register African American voters in Mississippi. But even as the song embodied the interracial struggles of the movement, it also achieved something that no other music from that era could or would do. It vociferously put the private contradictions within the civil rights movement about gender, sexuality, and the politics of nonviolence on stage for the entire world to see or share. Mississippi Goddamn unveiled the subconscious of Black America, not simply their struggle for racial equality at the time, but it also spoke on behalf of those most oppressed, those on the margins of Blackness, while prophesizing how those same folks, Black feminists, Black women, Black queer folk, would disrupt the center and occupy the nation's conscience as Black Lives Matter today. So 50 years after Simone's prominence, she's having a real peak. And I can list all the ways in which she's doing it, but I'll say that within this peak, Mississippi Goddamn is still a song that isn't covered, compared to, say, something like Feeling Good, which we see on anything from like Weight Watchers commercials to Shay's 50 Gray, or a song like Strange Fruit, which gets sampled by Kanye West and Common and other artists. So this is strange that Mississippi Goddamn is so uncovered for an artist who has gained her popularity and prominence primarily in her afterlife. But part of what I would like us to think about, and I'm going to move through this pretty quickly, is that the song itself is both kind of queer, it's an outlier, both sonically and socially. So the song that you just heard, she repeats that this is a show tune for a show that hasn't been written yet. But if you listen to the song, it's a strange mix of her training as a classical pianist, gospel pianist, blues, jazz, and folk artist, while mixing soul and rhythm to the lightheartedness of a kind of Rodgers and Hammerstein, Oklahoma. And yet it's still not a show tune. The puzzlement that she has stirred up in the music world is a product of her odd style, Ebony declared in 1959 when she first appeared on the scene. A strange grafting of a thick, abrasive, almost masculine sound onto a sophisticated classical music training. Her voice is a husky contralto, Ebony concluded. A sound, and this is me, defying the gender and genre conventions that audiences had come to expect of Black women performers like Ella Fitzgerald and Sarah Vaughan and even Billie Holiday. According to Daphne Brooks, Simone's asymmetrical gestures, vocal, generic, and compositional, repeatedly thwarted listeners from losing themselves in what Farrah Griffin has termed the romance of the Black female singing voice. But in addition to resisting musical categories, Simone's lyrics for the song in Mississippi Goddamn articulated a truth that too few women who marched alongside King could ever or would ever openly admit. That a political strategy rooted in respectability, Sunday best, and Christian piety was a Faustian bargain of sorts. Nonviolence offered little protection from the onslaught of the water hoses and arrest, especially for Black women who continued to be vulnerable to both the public racial humiliation and the private violence of sexual assault. And on that infamous Sunday morning in September, there was no place more virtuous in America than that Black church in Birmingham, and the dynamite blew up Addie Mae, Carol, Denise, and Cynthia anyway. But sadly, Simone, there's a famous quote when Simone meets King at Selma. She says, I'm not nonviolent. And King says, it's okay, sister, you don't have to be. Sadly, Simone paid a high price for her righteous damnation. Male entertainers of the caliber of Frank Sinatra and Oscar Brown Jr. can sprinkle their songs offerings with 4 words such as hell and damn and sermonize without fear of incurring the wraths of critics, wrote Sepia magazine in its 1967 expose on Simone. Nina Simone enjoys no such freedom, they concluded. As Simone's rage brazenly went against the gender scripts of the civil rights movement in song, her courage to do so, however, was steeped in the community in which she first found her political voice, a vanguard, though only partly visible community of Black queer artists who were also privately questioning and pushing back against the movement's demands for sexual conformity. Langston Hughes, her guide, Jimmy Baldwin, her running buddy, Lorraine Hansberry, her muse. As Baldwin's The Fire Next Time and Hansberry Raising the Sun, and also as Baldwin and Hansberry, encouraged by the earlier political poetry of Hughes and his direct mentorship, emerged as the literary voices of the era, their identities as gay and bisexual men and women were at odds with the civil rights strategy that appealed to the conscience of white America by upholding its more traditional sexual mores and attitudes. For these Black artists and activists whose lives upset such norms, the result was a formidable split between their private selves and their public civil rights engagement. Some things have come quite clear to me. For instance, that I'm stuck between my desire for both sexes, Simone wrote in her diary in the late 60s. I have known this. I've never really imagined other people knowing it. Now it is obvious they must have always known. Makes quite a problem for me, those who are not on the borderline. I didn't need to know Simone was bisexual for me to think of her as queer. Taylor Mack, a white playwright who goes professionally by the gender-bending pronoun Judy, told me in our interview last year. Mack is one of the few artists who actually covers Mississippi Goddamn in his forthcoming show, 24 Hours of American Popular Music. But he says, there was always something in her ability to tell the truth that made me consider her queer, and that had nothing to do with whom she did or did not have sex. In her twilight, Simone would say, it's hard for me to incorporate these songs now because they are not relevant to our times. But Simone's assumptions have been proven wrong as her song has taken on newer and even more startlingly greater prophetic resonance in our contemporary moment. For it is a time gap that catches, a show tune written for an unwritten show that is the allegory of how Black citizens have resisted their exclusion from and thereby reinvented the American nation state itself. In other words, Mississippi Goddamn is a song and a kind of a political expression of what I'm calling, or a sonic expression, prophetic rage. a simultaneous turning inward and outward, demanding that America has yet to live up to its promise, or there will be hell to pay. In its time, the song demanded the nation save itself from itself. Its return invites us to fight and fulfill that dream today. 2 Novembers ago, in response to the grand jury decision not to indict police officer Darren Wilson in the shooting of 18-year-old Michael Brown, the Guardian headline read, "Ferguson, goddamn, no indictment for Darren Wilson is no surprise. This is why we protest." And Color Lines did another piece called "Ferguson, goddamn." And the hashtag Ferguson goddamn also, went viral. And there's no other song I could listen to that Wednesday evening that could better channel out loud the sense of despair, disillusionment, and rage that I felt after Dylan Roof murdered 9 black parishioners in Charleston's Emmanuel AME Church. The civil rights movement, it seems, was a warm-up for Black Lives Matter today. This is because America, that once adolescent and cocksure country, as Richard Wright observed in 1943, has been forced yet again to come to terms with its own troubled past and present. A new generation of young artists and activists who make music with digital samplers, make use of the internet databases like YouTube and as a public archive of knowledge, amplify their ideas through memes and hashtags, and refuse the limits of respectability while embracing a fluid identity politics. And they have turned to history's lessons as a resource for understanding frustrations, the politics in the present. And amongst their influences, Simone stands out precisely because she is as contradictory, multitudinous, and large as American democracy itself. Our post-millennial social movements distinguish themselves by their unprecedented rejection of gender and sexuality binaries and a simultaneous embracing of an unapologetic blackness, what political scientist Kathy Cohen calls a black queer national politics. Simone's racial allegiance, coupled with her fluid gender and sexual identity, anticipated our paramount social justice movement of the moment, Black Lives Matter, which originated, as we know, with the 3 black female queer activists, Patrisse Cullors, Alicia Garza, and Opal Tometi. And this movement has been fueled by disruptive, mournful, political acts on a public stage. For this generation, Simone's boundarylessness, her bisexuality, her vocal androgyny, her genre breaking are not at odds with an unwavering racial pride. And that is not at odds with activists who are, to quote Kathy Cohen again, who are saying that not only are gay, lesbian, trans, and queer folk part of our communities, but they are part of the leadership of this movement. And they, for example, cis and trans women, have to be the center of how we think about Black liberation. And the centering of cis and trans women and lesbian and gay men as members of our community, as leaders in our community, is something significant and new, Cohen concludes. And I just want to hear, this is an important quote from Alicia Garza herself. She talks about the inception of Black Lives Matter is to rebuild what we think of as the Black Liberation Project, and to rebuild that by centering those furthest from the center itself. And so to listen to Mississippi Goddamn in this context is to hear the story of those who made our new America, a history of how those who were once mainstreamed and on the outer margins of blackness in the 1960s, people like Lorraine Hansberry, Timmy Baldwin, and Nina Simone, are now the most American today. She saved our lives, Toni Morrison once said of Nina Simone. She was indestructible, incorruptible. She made me even a little afraid. She told us to take up arms, and I have to confess that I was not ready to take up arms because I like to write. No doubt she was not ready to take up arms either, because everything happened in her music. In the end, Mississippi Goddamn, from Selma to Ferguson, has become the unlikely anthem for not just 1, but 2 generations in a country still longing to be free. Thank you. Yeah, we're gonna get to our seats. But this is a remix of Mississippi Goddamn. Oh, you can put it up a little. We're just gonna move to our seats. It's kind of cool when you hear it, for those of us who are hip-hop heads, because they're beatboxing.
Yeah. It's going well.
We can just hear the first part, and then we can go. So this is from a performance by Napoleon Maddox called A Riot Called Nina that he did in France in 2012. And he covers a lot of different Nina Simone songs and remixes them. But he found that the song was useful as a way to think about both kind of exile in the United States as a black person, as well as the kind of crisis of blackness and brownness in Paris. So, okay, it's taking a while, so we can. Well, 2 seconds. I need to speed this up. It's just kind of cool, but maybe it's just. Okay, you can cut it off now. He's just a beatbox poet, so it's kind of cool to hear him. Okay, thank you.
So that was great. I want to get some questions, but before that, I want to just put it in context in terms of what everybody did here. We had this panel for a reason, and all these people were brought together for a reason. What's going on in terms of not just Ferguson, but Chicago, Baltimore, history's happening all around us. One of the things I witnessed in the context of 2014 was my students at Tufts, all students, certainly students of color, but all of them were much more inspired to listen after Ferguson happened, to the point where students at Tufts shut down Davis Square, they shut down Harvard Square, and Tufts University students really led protests that went up to the MIT bridge and you know, had 1,000 people there. And extraordinary. But what was going on outside their windows really galvanized them to want to listen to the history of the civil rights struggle in a deeper way. So yeah, I want to put out a question to everybody here because, and then open it up. But you know, Yohuru Williams, his talk. And for those of you who think Yohuru's, you know, Stefan was saying that Yohuru, he didn't want to go after him. I think I've known Yohuru for many years, and I think he's the best speaker of our generation. So I think, you know, he's an incredible speaker. But he placed it in a larger context. You know, Barack Obama, Lyndon Johnson. What does democracy mean? And when we think about Seneca Falls, Selma, Stonewall. What does that mean for us today in terms of the 21st century, especially for those of us who are interested in policy, we're interested in how institutions work. When laws are passed and policies are passed, do they remain consistent through generations? And I would add, in terms of what Salamishah was saying, I would say it's really for 3 generations, not just 2. I'd say it's for at least 3 generations that Nina Simone is just so important to. Stefan Bradley, who does great work on Black power and radicalism and social movements, especially as they connect to higher education, really gave us a searing journey, his own journey in St. Louis, in Ferguson, talking about fluorescent, all these avenues and these streets that have become very much like home to those of us who were really into what was going on in Ferguson and drilling down and trying to find out. But what I loved about his talk was the way in which, when we think about state-sanctioned violence in the context of contemporary America, it is certainly linked to what happened during the Great Society and before. And Elizabeth Hinton, who's gonna be here tomorrow, her talk is gonna be connected to that. And so I love the fact that you stood with your students, but Dr. King called that, and so did others during the heroic period of the civil rights movement, and James Baldwin called it bearing witness, because that's what he did. You know, he talked about Black people bearing witness to what was going on in terms of the pain, the suffering. Stokely called it raw terror, because he was in Alabama and in Mississippi and living there. And what I always tell students and everybody that Stokely Carmichael was one of the people, and Ella Baker too. They lived in the deep South. They were from places like New York and others, and they moved down south and slept on the floors of shotgun shacks in Alabama and in the Mississippi Delta, stuff that none of us will ever do. And they saw a different side of America there. And Stokely called it raw terror because he saw people get killed and he couldn't believe it. He was surprised. There was no small d democracy in parts of Mississippi and Alabama in that context. And then finally, Salamishah, I think that's a brilliant talk in terms of Nina Simone. She is having a recurrent moment right now. There's a great documentary on Nina Simone. Nina was a genius, very important figure, but the way in which, when you look at Nina Simone and Mississippi Goddamn, you can centralize the experience of black women. And black women have been so important to not just black liberation strategies, but really American democracy. Without Ida B. Wells, without Mary Church Terrell, without Nannie Helen Burroughs, without black women, the way in which we think about democracy, the way in which we think about the labor movement, the way in which we think about childcare and healthcare would be impossible. It would be absolutely impossible. But we rarely link their political activism to policies. Martin Luther King Jr. had to be schooled about welfare policy by black women who were part of the National Welfare Rights Organization. They had to school on what policies they wanted, and he became a quick study, but initially he entered that meeting thinking he knew what they wanted. So it's important, that's an important intervention. And certainly when we think about trans and queer politics, very, very important in the way in which we think about the Black Lives Matter movement. It's trying to decenter the usual narrative and think about race and class and gender and geography and even leadership in really new and interesting and innovative ways. But they're building on what Ella Baker, who said that strong people don't need strong leaders. They're building on what academics call participatory democracy, but no one in 1960 did. They're building on that, this idea of collective leadership and collective political activism. So the question I want to ask you all, in terms of from Selma to Ferguson and then open it up, how do we move forward? Charlene's Race Matters project is talking about solutions. She just gave a brilliant keynote about multiple sites of intervention. We're at a policy school. A lot of our students are gonna go work in local, state, national government, some in higher education. How do we move forward given what we've seen, especially since we've seen President Obama visit a federal prison? I think that's directly connected to Black Lives Matter and Alicia and Opal and Brittany and Tef Poe and T-Dubbo and all the activism that we've seen, Philip Agnew. How do we move forward to each of you? Then I'll open it up. No one wants to go first. These guys are being shy now. This loquacious trio.
I'll go first. The bumpkin will go first. I'll say this, that we try to make these things super complex. It's the formula for solving something has always been the same. You identify what the problem is, you analyze the problem, then you outline a strategy and you implement the strategy, and then you evaluate the strategy. It's not that difficult in that sense, but now you add the people factor, and that's when it becomes difficult. I'd say this, what's happening out where I come from is very sharp. These young people have been able to help public policy people in office, help them to identify and to pinpoint some of these ways that poor people have been disenfranchised. They've been able to do so by showing just how crazy these fine systems work out. And because of that, you see changes in the system. So in the city, some of these fines have been changed in ways that it doesn't make sense somebody who is not making any money to fine them $500 for something, and then when they can't pay it, they got to go to jail. So you could become a criminal quite easily from driving a car and being poor. And so identifying the issues have been very important. And that requires a certain amount of education. And that's where I say that it's really up to us, particularly in higher education, to not only educate these students on the yard, but to take our messages, you had mentioned this earlier, Brother Joseph, to take our messages a little bit farther out into the streets. And so a lot of times we get tricked into believing that we're broke at the university, but we should spend part of our Black History Month time speaking to high school students and finding out what exactly they know. And that's I think the most beautiful part about what I saw today is the idea that what we thought we knew as educators was really so small in contrast to what I found these young people knew when they began to become active. And so the idea that this student that I was referring to that was pepper sprayed and that sort of thing, his partner, who happened to be on one of Brother Williams' slides, was the young lady who carried him to his mentor's house. These young people know that they don't have to depend on a messianic Black preacher figure and things like this. They have identified that as being necessarily a problem, and so they're now implementing new ways of dealing with things. And so I think that identification, that analysis, that design, and then implementation and evaluation has to be the way we go.
I'll follow up. I guess I want to piggyback on what Stefan said about like centralizing youth voices, because in my political work, which inspires this project in a lot of ways, I work primarily with young women and girls who are finding their political voices and becoming activists in their communities. And so, again, like, I think it's easy, but also I think it's very difficult. Partly what I think is difficult is pushing back against the kind of well-worn narratives of what freedom looks like and what leadership looks like. And I think what we're seeing in this moment is a really radical intervention, building off of like a SNCC model in some ways, building off a Black Panther model in other ways, but also something like beautifully new. And so part of that, though, requires like a kind of diligence and rigor and self-correction. And so as someone who's like participated in like the Say Her Name part of Black Lives Matter, I recently had the opportunity when Patrice and Opal came to campus just to ask, because I've theorized and talked about and on the ground, like, you know, your Say Her Name is a movement within a movement to articulate the ways in which girls and Black women are also victims of state violence, but also to push back on the kind of impetus that we have to organize around Black men who are victims and Black boys who are state violence, as opposed to the kind of knee-jerk response or lack of knee-jerk response to organize around the lives of Black women. Anyway, so I asked, you know, what if Black Lives Matter is a movement that is so radical in its origins, then why would you need to Say Her Name? Like, it should have unfolded the way that we would hope it would unfold. And so on one hand, you know, there's a pessimistic part would say that it's hard to really keep that center. It's hard to keep Black trans women and men center, Black queer folks center. But at the same time, Say Her Name is also like real-time self-correction that we don't necessarily, we see it with earlier movements, but it was so explicit and so in your face that we kind of have to keep on wrestling with it. So for me, I guess it's like centering women's voices, centering young people's voices, centering Black queer voices, and doing it rigorously and diligently, because I really do believe that like it's from the margins of Blackness that America, you know, that democracy is born. And so I guess I'm trying to do a prehistory, like look at these figures from the 60s, the ones we kind of know so well, but understand the ways in which they kind of had to wrestle with like a public face and a private life, and recognize that like multiple generations have engaged Nina Simone or engaged Baldwin, but there's something about the current moment that's able to fully put it on stage, right? And I'm like from your generation, so it is hip hop in many ways that has allowed us to hear Nina Simone differently, but there's something, but we didn't have the same kind of Black Lives Matter moment, nor were we centering the same voices. We were debating about, you know, still debating, I guess, about an inclusiveness, inclusive Blackness. So anyway, that's...
I'm quick, but I'll go to Charlene, and I agree with both of you, but it's toddlers and tiaras in a lot of ways, and I love when you told that story. Coming off the elevator last night at 12 o'clock at night, I'm walking down the hallway to AT&T Center, and I come across a photograph of Heman Sweat. And I'm standing there, I'm transfixed for a moment, because I'm like, wait a minute, Peniel hasn't been here long enough for this. I'm kidding. So I'm standing there and I'm looking at this photo of Heman Sweat, and I'm in this moment where I take a photograph of it, and it's blowing my mind that I'm on campus, and I don't know if 90% of people that pass that photograph are going to be moved in the same way that I was moved, because this is somebody who we like to tell young people, and I was on the ground in Ferguson long after you were talking to young people with the National Alliance for Faith and Justice. We love to tell young people you stand on the shoulders of giants, but Charlene, your generation proves that they didn't stand on the shoulders of giants, they are the giants. Yeah. You need to tell young people you are the giants. Nice. The danger is that in saying you are the giants, they assume that they know everything, and we saw this with the March of Millions in D.C., where the young people want to grab the mic, and you're trying to have this conversation with them about what's the ask. And this is to Salamishah's point. What I loved about your talk and where I think you take us to the next level, and that takes us to the next level, is that it really then at the core is about reimagining the American dream and decoupling democracy from what we mean by the American dream. If the American dream means 2.5 kids in a house in the suburbs, right, then that reimagination project ain't ever going to work in the way that, but if it is thinking about it in an expansive way that people like Langston Hughes and Nina Simone and Lorraine Hansberry Raising in the Sun, that's the tension between Walter Lee Younger and Benitha. That's the tension. Is Benitha's like, well, we would take that money and go use it in the service of our people on the continent of Africa and then come back and use it in the service of the people in the neighborhoods in which we live. And that's a very different conception of democracy than I'm going to open a liquor store.
All right. Time-wise, yeah, you know what? We're gonna give everybody. We'll do one question, then give everybody a break. Yes, can we? Do we have a mic right here?
I'll speak loud.
No, we need the mic. We are very formal here.
Yes, hello. I really appreciated this, and thank you for hosting this.
Can you tell us your name, please?
My name is Kathleen Hall, and my question is, what role do whites play in helping to move this forward? Yeah, I mean, what role do you think whites and Asians and others have, for that matter, in rolling this forward?
I'll be very quick. A reporter met with Lorraine Hansberry after Raising the Sun came out, and the reporter said to Lorraine Hansberry, why, this isn't a play about Negroes, this could be a play about anybody. What do you say to that? And Lorraine Hansberry responded, well, I had noticed a contradiction because I was always under the impression that Negroes are people. I think that what blew me away in D.C. is that it was this rainbow coalition of young people that were there marching and chanting, hands up, don't shoot, and singing these protest songs and being deeply engaged, that in some sense made me feel very good about this moment because they see themselves in the mirror of what's happening, and they see this as a moratorium on democracy. I was blown away in 2008 by the number of white students that I saw who were activated and were engaged in the election of Obama, and then in the Occupy movement, and now in the Black Lives Matter movement. So I think it's more a question of investing people in the idea, as Salamishah and Stefan talked about, and certainly Charlene, about understanding that democracy is what's at stake, and we own or have the opportunity to define what that means in the 21st century. Not giving into this notion that somehow, the Archie Bunker America of the 1970s that I grew up in, where what you got is in, because that's what creates the there goes my everything moment where, oh my God, there are black people playing baseball, shut it down. And so we need to be in that moment where we're recognizing that our shared humanity is what propels this movement forward, not our desire to somehow win in a way that Donald Trump is trying to invest half of America in his campaign.
So I guess I'll just follow up. So Lorraine Hansberry's last play, however, was the window at Sydney, I get the title wrong, but the last sign of Sydney Brewster window. And it's an all-white cast, right? So it's a kind of counterpart to Raisin in the Sun. And in this final play, the one she dies obviously prematurely of cancer at age 35, she's really lamenting the loss of what she thought was a kind of radical alliance between progressive whites and progressive blacks at the time, right? So Hansberry, it's a good example, is really invested in what happens when you decouple the Freedom Project from Black Lives Mattering. And I think what's beautiful and challenging again about this moment is, I think this is a different generation. This is the generation, and I'm going to quote, I'm really bad at quoting hip hop lyrics, so hopefully I don't do this too wrong. But when Jay-Z has that line, like, I didn't cross over to you, the suburbs crossed over to me. I mean, this is the generation that grew up with a certain maybe commodified notion of blackness as their vision of America, but still it's different than the 60s in the sense that Blackness is both normative and central, and yet obviously deeply, Black lives are deeply disenfranchised. And so you have that kind of contradiction. But I think there's a lot more possibility with young people. Now, the question I think comes, how do you get like older white Americans to be part of a movement? I mean, I think that, and not to say that young white people are on the front lines and doing all the radical work that they need to be doing, but it is in many ways both a movement that centralizes Black queer, Black women, Black people on the margins, and it's an interracial movement in many ways. It's just a movement that says we're gonna take Black life seriously at its core, and that doesn't mean that we don't like white people, but that it's also convincing or trying to challenge white people. What does it mean to take Black life seriously at the core of your identity, right? And then if that's true, then how do we move this project of democracy forward over and over again? My first book was on slavery and how we remember slavery in the post-civil rights imagination. And again, it was like an attempt to understand why African Americans are so faithful to this project of American democracy. We're the most faithful in many ways, as we're the most disenfranchised. And Black Lives Matter, I think, is another articulation of that. But for me, it's a more radical, more enraged, and more in-your-face articulation of that. And we'll see where it goes. But I have faith that at least in its current inception, that something will change.
Okay, Stefan, 1 minute.
Go ahead. Oh, just...
I think it's you, yeah.
Oh, he tried to hit me with the 1 minute. I see how you tried to do me, brother. Look, you brought me all the way up from St. Louis. I'm going to take the mic. Here's the deal. I think what's the role of white people? How can white people help? I need you to taste the tear gas with the people. I think you need to do that. I also think this, though, and this is the really hard part, because some of my white students were out with my Black students and everything else. The really hard part is this. It's difficult to be out tasting the tear gas and running from whatever, but it's much more difficult for you to go home at Easter and sit at your table and try to explain that Black Lives Matter. It's easy. It's a little bit easier to wear the pin when you're on the yard at the college and the university and that sort of thing, but it's a little more difficult to make that mean something to your Uncle Joe who doesn't believe the same way. And you can have those conversations in ways that I can't. I like to think of myself as handsome and influential and all those kinds of things, but for whatever reason, sometimes people don't, particularly white people, don't hear me when I'm saying that there are disparities in the way that African Americans and white Americans are treated in this country. You can help in that way, help to convince and to show family members that I'm not making this up. That's been the hardest thing about all of this idea of police brutality and the abuse of power and this sort of thing. Some of us knew this for a while. We didn't need videotapes, a study, a commission, or anything else. Perhaps you could share that notion with other people.
All right. Thank you. So this.